This scene is familiar throughout the world, the annual Nobel Prize awarding ceremonies. But what do we really know about the background of the Nobel Prize and the man who started it all, Alfred Nobel? The family lived in a modest home in Stockholm, where the father, Emanuel Nobel, had a small business. Alfred was born in 1833. Business was poor, and Emanuel decided to try his fortune in St. Petersburg, Russia. Emanuel set up a mechanical workshop which eventually developed into a successful business. Among other things, he supplied materials to the Russian government. He also manufactured furnaces for the civil market. When he was 17, Alfred was sent to study abroad, to Germany, France, England, and even to North America. Around 1850, Alfred Nobel met a scientist, Ascanio Sobrero, who was doing research in explosives. Using a mixture of sulfuric acid and nitric acid, he managed to produce a highly explosive oil, which was very dangerous to handle. He called it nitroglycerin. To find a safer form of explosive, Nobel also began to work with nitroglycerin. He succeeded in carrying out a controlled explosion. According to the story, he filled a glass tube with nitroglycerin, corked it, and put it in a tin tube, which he filled with gas. He lit the fuse and threw the tube into a pond. The detonation was so strong that the ground shook. In 1863, Nobel received his first patent for what he called Nobel's nitroglycerin, or Nobel's patented blasting oil. Moving back home to his family in Stockholm, Alfred worked with his father and youngest brother Emil in a small laboratory. But they were not careful, and early one morning the whole lab blew up. 5 people were killed, including Alfred's brother Emil, 22 years old. It was 1864. Alfred's father had a stroke and never recovered after what all of Stockholm was calling the Nobel blast. But Alfred refused to give up. He knew he was on the right track to produce a safe explosive. He was not allowed to manufacture his explosive within the Stockholm city limits, so he had to experiment on a big barge on Lake Mälar, 10 kilometers from the city. The Swedish Nitroglycerin Company was formed in 1864, the first company of its kind in the world. The research manager, managing director, operations manager, correspondent, traveling salesman, advertising manager, and financial director were all Alfred Nobel. He launched Nobel's patented blasting oil. Nobel's explosive oil was a success right from the beginning, and with his great talent for business, he marketed his product with skill. He obtained financing and built a factory for explosives in Vinterviken, west of Stockholm. People dared to invest in this new product because they knew that within the near future, large quantities of explosives would be needed. Plans were already well advanced to build a railway tunnel right through the southern hills of Stockholm to join the 2 main railway lines from the north and south. Alfred Nobel invited Crown Prince Oscar to a demonstration. A deep hole had been bored in the rock and it was filled with blasting oil. The demonstration was a success. In 1865, Nobel left Sweden to set up new factories abroad. The first was in Krümmel, near Hamburg in northern Germany. But Nobel's blasting oil was not risk-free either. Among other things, there had been serious accidents during transport and due to faulty storage, in which the nitroglycerin had changed through chemical decomposition. Now restrictions began to appear. In many countries, it was prohibited to use or transport the blasting oil. There were only two alternatives: to stop production or to develop a safer explosive. Nobel did not give up. He traveled to demonstrate that his explosive oil was not dangerous to handle. He set it on fire. He filled a bottle with the oil and threw it down a mountainside, and it did not explode. The public was fascinated. But Nobel realized that there must be some substance that could be mixed with the oil to make it even safer. He tried carbon powder, sawdust, cement, brick dust, and finally kieselguhr, a type of sand with grains as fine as powder. Now he felt he was on the right track. The result was a pliable compound that could be formed into rods and enclosed in paper tubes, which in turn could be fitted to the diameter of a borehole. Nobel called his invention dynamite, and it was dynamite that became the foundation of his worldwide corporate empire. 1866. Despite minor changes, we still make dynamite today almost the same way as in Nobel's day. Tunnels and enormous canal projects like those of Corinth in Greece and Panama suddenly became possible. And the whole mining industry was modernized. Alfred Nobel's greatness lay in his ability to combine the brilliance of a scientist and inventor with the vision and dynamism of a businessman. He built companies and laboratories in 90 cities in over 20 countries. You could say that Nobel created the first multinational business empire in Europe. But Nobel was not a brutal business tycoon. As early as the 1870s, he gave his employees free medical care, old age pensions, and free schooling for their children. He also realized that further training was important. Constant, tiring trips, a worldwide correspondence in French, English, German, Russian, and Swedish. Nobel was called the world's richest vagabond. In big cities, even if he was alone, there were a lot of people around him. He bought an elegant villa in Paris, near the Arch of Triumph. But Nobel needed a competent secretary. He put an advertisement in a Vienna newspaper in which he described himself as a wealthy, highly educated older gentleman living in Paris looking for a lady of mature age with a skill in languages as a secretary and housekeeper. At the time, he was scarcely 43 years old. One Berta Kinski answered. She spoke English, German, French, and Italian. She was musical and literary. Berta Kinski was most satisfactory, but she soon left him to return to Vienna and marry. Now Nobel was just as alone as before. His older brothers, Robert and Ludwig Nobel, had stayed in Russia. In Baku on the Caspian Sea, they were established as oil magnates. With financial support from Alfred, they formed the Nobel Brothers Crude Petroleum Company. It quickly grew into a major exporter, thanks greatly to Ludwig's technical talent. He designed pumps and the pipelines of the day. He designed the world's first oil tanker and had it built. It was soon followed by other, bigger tankers, and they could pump the oil directly into the ship's tanks. That was before 1880. The 1880s were a decade of arms race in Europe. Everywhere they tried to develop new and more efficient explosives with less smoke. In 1887-88, Nobel patented an efficient, low-smoke explosive, which he called ballistite. But he came into conflict with the French authorities over patent rights, and the French finally forced him to close his lab and cease all his work in France. Nobel was forced to leave the country where he felt most at home. He moved his manufacturing to Italy and built a villa in San Remo, where a new laboratory was also set up. Alfred Nobel was a scientist. He wrote poetry and plays and was actively involved in the peace movement. In his correspondence and meetings with Bertha von Suttner, now one of the leaders of the peace movement in Europe, whom he had once known as Bertha Kinsky, he is said to have stated, "If weapons were destructive enough, wars would cease by themselves." That idea has been put forth in our own time. Many have thought of the nuclear bomb in the same terms. Nobel hardly had what we would call a healthy life. Long, tiring journeys, irregular work, and mealtimes all strained his health. Severe migraines and recurring heart trouble reduced his work capacity. On one occasion, when he was being treated for a heart ailment, he said, "It's an irony of fate that I, of all people, should be given nitroglycerin for internal use." But Nobel thought that he needed a larger laboratory and real workshops to implement his many ideas. In Bofors, Sweden, there was an established engineering industry with skilled workers. 2 years before his death, Nobel bought shares in the company, and soon he was running it. Nobel moved into Björkborn Manor House, close to his new lab, which had very modern equipment for the time. Nobel worked mainly with weapons manufacture in Bofors, but also with many other things than explosives and weapons. The papers he left behind him contain no less than 355 registered patents in a wide variety of fields. Here are some of Nobel's inventions or improvements on inventions. A method for producing artificial silk thread. A method for raising the temperature of flames for soldering and welding. Improved light bulbs. A synthetic rubber. Artificial leather. There was great demand for drive belts in the rapidly growing industry of the time. Military rockets, or flying torpedoes as they were called, also had an important civil application in shooting safety lines when rescuing people in shipwrecks. Another use was to shoot up a rocket with a camera hanging from a parachute. When the parachute opened, the camera took a picture of the ground below. This method was no longer interesting when people learned how to fly hot air balloons. Nobel's interest in balloon travel was apparent when he paid for half the costs of Swedish engineer André's attempt to fly over the North Pole in a balloon in 1897. Another invention that fascinated Nobel was the new light metal, aluminum. He had a 12-meter-long boat built of this material, a very exclusive ship that was driven by a small steam engine. Nobel was also interested in helping young inventors with money or ideas from his vast store of experience. One example is two brothers, Birger and Fredrik Ljungström, and their Svea velocipede. When he was 16, Birger had designed what he called a roller catch in the rear wheel, similar to today's free